I have here a fascinating document from 1891, 125 years old. It's from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it was created for internal circulation inside the museum for museum staff. And what it is a list. It's specifically meant to be a catalog of all desirable objects without reference to present limitations of means or space. That's a really ambitious document. It's filled with page after page of every major work of sculptural art from antiquity through the Renaissance. It has thousands and thousands of objects and where they can be found. This document was supposed to be the basis for a master collection that would illustrate the entire known history of sculptural art. But it was not describing originals. It was describing plaster copies, plaster casts, high quality, high fidelity, full-scale plaster casts that were made from molds made directly from the original works. In the 1800s, plaster casts were everywhere. Every major museum, every major university, every art school had plaster cast collections. It's hard to overstate how important plaster casts were in creating the foundations for the modern Western aesthetic. Plaster casts created a common reference point across the world for artists and archaeologists and art lovers to study ancient works of art. Western eyes were trained on plaster casts. The most fascinating thing about this document is the right-hand column. Those are prices. The plaster cast culture of sharing was so mature, so routine, that the Met was able to compile a master price list of every object that they wanted to acquire. That means that when a museum wanted to acquire a new work, they didn't have to negotiate terms of use. There were no questions about how will this be used, how will it be displayed, who will have access to it. It was simply routine. It was commoditized and it was shared freely. In 1891, you could buy a full-scale plaster cast of the Venus De Milo that was produced by the Louvre's own atelier for 140 francs. No questions asked. At the beginning of the 20th century, though, the plaster cast tradition fell out of favor. Museums began emphasizing the original works that they had in their collections, and plaster cast collections began being disassembled, put into storage, sold off piece by piece. Some of them were lost, and some of them were physically destroyed. In 2013, I visited one of the world's few large remaining plaster cast collections in Switzerland, the Sculpture Hall Basel Plaster Cast Museum. They have an incredible collection of over 2,000 plaster casts from this era, and they allow people to come in and study them, copy them, do research on them. They have life-size and over-life-size copies of almost every major work you could hope to study. They have hundreds and hundreds of fragments and miniature casts of smaller works. It's a really incredible collection, and they allowed me to spend a week there making 3D captures of whatever I wanted. One of the pieces in their collection that I focused on, I captured about just over a dozen of their pieces. One of them was a very high quality cast of Venus De Milo that was made in 1850 by the Louvre itself. I used a regular digital camera and Autodesk's Memento photogrammetry software. I took over 600 photographs of Venus De Milo and used Memento to process them into a high-quality 3D model of Venus De Milo. Those are all the camera positions. This is actually a third of the camera positions I used. This is a rendering of my 3D model of Venus De Milo. This is, to my knowledge, the highest quality copy, digital copy of Venus De Milo ever produced. And in keeping with that plaster cast tradition that allowed me to make this copy, I published this model online for free without any restrictions without any commercial restrictions so that anybody in the world could use this model however they wanted. What I'd like to show you now is also in keeping with that plaster cast tradition. They're projects that I did not try to anticipate or plan for, but that other people have made using the scans that I've made available, including Venus De Milo. The first project comes from a VFX artist in Athens, Georgios Cherovim, and he's created something he calls geophone. What he's done is he takes a 3D scan and he converts the vertex positions and orders and converts them into sound waves. So now, for the first time, we get to hear Venus De Milo. Now that we have a 3D model of Venus De Milo, we can address the most obvious question about her. The next project is by a friend of mine, Virginia Postrel, who's been doing research on textile technology, the history of textile technology. And in the course of that research, she encountered the theory that Venus De Milo was originally depicted spinning thread using ancient tools in the ancient technique. Postrel commissioned me to produce an anatomically plausible reconstruction of Venus De Milo spinning thread. We started with 5th century Athenian painted vases that depict women spinning thread with tools in a position that looked like it might be plausible for Venus De Milo. The end product was this 3D print of Venus De Milo spinning thread. There have been many reconstructions of Venus De Milo's arms over the years. This one is particularly interesting because, to my eye at least, it's one of the few reconstructions, it's one of the few activities that Venus could be depicted doing that actually requires the somewhat odd posture that she's depicted in. The next project is the Byzantium 1200 project, which is out of Istanbul. And this project's aim is to create a detailed 3D reconstruction of every major structure and monument from Istanbul from the year 1200 AD. They've taken my 3D capture of Emperor Augustus and used it as a basis to create a reproduction of the full-figure prima porta portrait of Emperor Augustus. They've also taken my 3D capture of Winged Victory and used it to recreate a statue complete with the arms and head of the goddess Nike, which was thought to exist in the Hippodrome in Istanbul. This next project comes by way of the British Museum. That's a group from the Elgin Marbles from the Parthenon. This particular piece is described by the British Museum as the most beloved marble from the entire Elgin Marbles collection. I scanned this marble with a regular digital camera in the British Museum, visiting like a regular tourist, just taking photos from whatever angles I could. I created a model using Memento, and I published that data online. And I created this full-size copy. It's a 1-to-1 copy with the original. I created this with a regular consumer-grade 3D printer with a MakerBot, and it was actually used as part of MakerBot's display at CES a few years ago. And you can see it hangs over a ledge here like it did in the original, like it did in the Parthenon. It's hanging over this ledge here. And it's actually a little tippy. It could be knocked over fairly easily. So in this crush of people at CES, I was keeping an eye on the horse head there the entire time. And at one point, I noticed somebody had their hands all over it, and it was tipping over a little bit. And I was about to stop this person from touching it, but before I reached him, he turned around, and I realized he was blind. I realized he'd been exploring the horse with his hands in a way that he would never have been able to with the original marble. And that right there was an important lesson for me in why it's so important to make this data available without trying to plan or anticipate how it will be used. Even something as simple as a tactile display for the blind had not occurred to me. But it just goes to show that people will spontaneously, on their own, without direction, even there in the moment, find uses for this data so long as it's made available. Since that episode, I've been keeping track of every instance I can find of people making use of the data that I've made available. I've been keeping a Pinterest board of photos I find online. So this next project is actually hundreds of projects. These are the creations of students, art lovers, artists, people all over the world. I don't know who they are. It doesn't really matter who they are. The fact is that they're creating objects that clearly have some value and meaning to them. Here's Venus De Milo and Winged Victory. And when I see these two together like this, 3D printed, I think of a quote from Umberto Eco, who wrote that 2 cliches make us laugh, but 100 cliches move us. We sense dimly that they're talking to each other and that they're celebrating a reunion. When all of the archetypes burst in shamelessly, we reach Homeric depths. A sort of primal narrative force takes over, and something is created beyond art, beyond any attempt to direct it, and it's something that's worthy of awe. When I look at these works, I think how much has been done with the few scans that I've created and shared, and I think how much more could these people do if they had access to even more. There are influential universities and museums and private collectors who have extremely high quality 3D scans of important works of art. Michelangelo's, Bernini's, Donatello's, Rodin's, important artifacts. But in sharp contrast to the 19th century plaster cast tradition, these institutions have not made their data available to the public. I believe that museums should not be repositories of secret knowledge. And I'd like to ask you in this audience, because you're in such a special position, when you work with these institutions, when you talk to them about how to create new scans, how to make cool new visualizations using their existing scans, please take that opportunity to urge them to share the scans that they already have and to share the scans that they're still making, so that all of these works can join in on this reunion and take part in this new digital narrative. Thank you.